The entire restaurant held its breath. Chairman Ban Dongmin, the most feared crime lord in Seoul, had just been insulted by a high society guest for his fisherman's roots. The room waited for blood. But before the chairman's son could respond, a voice cut through the tension, soft, respectful, but unmistakably wrong. A young black waitress, head bowed in a perfect 45-degree angle, greeted the chairman not in standard Seoul Korean, but in the ancient Gyeongsang Sadori, a dialect so rare and noble it hadn't been heard in the underworld for 3 generations. The clatter of silverware stopped. The air turned to glass. Chairman Ban's hand froze an inch from his glass. He wasn't just shocked. He was terrified, because only 2 types of people know that dialect, the descendants of Southern royalty. And the ghosts of families his organization destroyed. The kitchen of the Gilded Lotus, Seoul's most obscenely expensive fusion restaurant, smelled of black truffle jjiggy, dry-aged hanwoo, and pure, unadulterated terror. Move, move, move. If that silverware isn't polished to a mirror finish, I will personally see to it that you never work in this country again. Director Hwang Taesung was a man spiraling toward a complete nervous collapse. He dabbed at the sweat pooling on his upper lip with a monogrammed handkerchief, his eyes darting between the clock and the velvetroped private entrance. It was 7:55 p.m. They had 5 minutes. Melissa Peacock adjusted her apron, keeping her head down. She hated nights like this. At 24, she had perfected the art of being invisible. She wore her coily hair in a tight, practical braid that pulled at her scalp, and she wore oversized black-rimmed glasses she didn't actually need, just to create a barrier between her sharp, observant brown eyes and the prying stares of the chaebol sons and tech moguls who frequented the place. Peacock SSI, Director Hwang barked, snapping his fingers in her face. She flinched, gripping her tray tighter. Yes, Director. You are on water duty, sparkling still and ice, nothing else. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact. Do not even breathe too loudly. Do you understand? Yes, sir. But who is coming? Director Hwang looked at her, as if she'd just asked what color the sky was. The Ban family Melissa, Chairman Ban Dongmin, and his son Baeon Jiwoo, the Hwangi, the Emperor of the South. They've rented the entire VIP lounge. A 300 million dinner bill is expected. If you spill a single drop of Evian, I will feed you to the Han River. Melissa felt ice trace its way down her spine. The Bans. Even in the shelter of the kitchen, she knew the name. Everyone in Seoul knew the name, though few dared to whisper it aloud. They owned shipping empires, luxury hotels, and half the National Assembly. But that was just the surface. Underneath, they were the iron fist of Korea's organized underworld, the architects of fortunes built on blood and buried secrets. I understand, she whispered. She turned back to the polishing station, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up a crystal water glass. She wasn't trembling from fear of the Mafia, though. She was trembling because the name ban triggered memories she had spent a decade trying to bury. Memories of a sunlit embassy garden in Paris, of her father's laughter, and of a life that had been stolen from her in a single night of fire, betrayal, and silenced screams. Just keep your head down, she told herself. You're just Melissa, the waitress. You're nobody. Hey, a soft voice whispered beside her. It was Dee Hyun, the sous chef, looking concerned. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, Dee Hyun, Melissa lied, forcing a weak smile. Director Hwang is just intense tonight. It's the Bans, Dee Hyun muttered, checking the sear on a pan of galbajam. Rumor has it Chairman Ban is in a foul mood. A deal in Busan went south. Lost 30 billion. He's looking for someone to take it out on. Melissa didn't reply. She just focused on the glass in her hand, rubbing a non-existent smudge until the crystal squeaked. Outside, the heavy oak doors of the restaurant swung open. The air in the kitchen seemed to be sucked out into the dining room. Silence fell over the line cooks. Even the sizzling of the pans seemed to quiet down. Director Hwang burst back into the kitchen, his face ashen. They're here, line up. Everyone line up. The entourage didn't walk, they prowled. 8 men in total entered the Gilded Lotus. 6 of them were clearly bodyguards, hulking walls of muscle squeezed into black suits that cost more than Melissa's yearly rent. They wore earpieces and scanned the room with dead, shark-like eyes. But the two men in the center absorbed all the light in the room. To the left was Baeon Jiwoo. He was undeniably devastating, tall, perhaps 62, with shoulders that filled out his bespoke midnight blue Tom Ford suit with predatory grace. His hair was jet black, slicked back but not severe, and his jawline looked like it had been carved from obsidian. He didn't look at the staff lined up by the wall. He looked through them, checking exits, checking sightlines. He was the enforcer, the future king. A Sig Sauer was likely tucked beneath that tailored jacket, resting against his ribs. And then there was Chairman Ban Dongmin. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, walking with the measured confidence of a man who had never needed to hurry for anyone. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit and a long cashmere overcoat draped over his shoulders like a royal mantle. His face was a map of hard-won battles, deep lines etched around a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile decades ago. His eyes were dark, hooded, and utterly terrifying. He carried an ebony cane topped with a silver dragon's head, though Melissa suspected he didn't actually need it. The cane was a statement, a reminder. I have survived everything you haven't. Director H. Wang bowed, so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. Chairman Ban, young Master Baeon, it is the greatest honor. Chairman Ban waved him off without a word, his gaze sweeping over the restaurant like a king surveying conquered territory. And then, for just a fraction of a second, his eyes landed on Melissa. She kept her head down, her breathing shallow. Don't look up, don't move, don't exist. But she could feel his gaze, like a blade pressed against her throat. And somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the fear and the carefully constructed mask of invisibility, a small, dangerous voice whispered, "He doesn't remember you. But you remember him." The first rule of survival in a place like the Gilded Lotus was simple: never be memorable. Melissa had learned this lesson the hard way, in a dozen different cities under a dozen different names. In Paris, she'd been Marie, a chambermaid at the Ritz. In London, Clara, a bookshop clerk in Notting Hill. In Tokyo, she'd served tea in a ryokan where Yakuza bosses came to forget their wars for a weekend. Each time, the pattern was the same. Keep your head down. Smile when expected. Fade into the wallpaper. Survive. Seoul was supposed to be different. Seoul was supposed to be her last stop, the place where she could finally exhale and let the past stay buried. But as she polished the water glasses in the back corridor of the VIP lounge, listening to the muffled chaos of the kitchen behind her, Melissa realized she'd been lying to herself. There was no last stop, not for people like her, not for the daughters of dead diplomats who knew too many secrets and had seen too many faces. She moved through her routine with mechanical precision. Check the ice buckets, refill the sparkling water carafes, adjust the ambient lighting in the lounge so it cast the Ban family's table in a warm, flattering glow. Director H. Wang had given her a 17-point checklist, and she'd memorized every item before her shift even started. That was the problem with having a perfect memory. You couldn't forget anything, even when forgetting would be a mercy. Through the frosted glass partition, she could see the Ban family settling into their seats. Chairman Ban sat at the head of the table, his posture regal despite his age. Baeon Jiwoo sat to his right, his expression unreadable as he scanned the room one final time. The bodyguards had taken positions at the three entrances to the lounge, their hands resting casually near their concealed weapons. Melissa's hands moved on autopilot, arranging the glassware, but her mind was elsewhere. She was calculating. It was a habit she couldn't break, a skill drilled into her by her father during long summers at the embassy compound. Always know your exits, Melissa. Always know who's watching. Always know who holds the real power in the room. Chairman Ban held the power. That much was obvious. But Jiwoo was the danger. She could see it in the way he moved, in the coiled tension beneath his expensive suit. He was the kind of man who could smile at you over dinner and slit your throat before dessert arrived. She'd met men like him before. Some of them were even still alive. Peacock SSI. Director H. Wang appeared at her elbow, his voice a harsh whisper. They're ready for water service. Go, now, and for the love of God, do not embarrass me. Melissa nodded, lifting the tray of crystal glasses with practiced ease. The weight was familiar, comforting even. It gave her hands something to do, a reason to keep her eyes down and her expression neutral. She pushed through the partition door and entered the VIP lounge. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Chairman Ban was speaking in low tones to an older man seated across from him, someone Melissa didn't recognize, though his Patek Philippe watch and custom-tailored handbag suggested he was either old money or new power trying to look like old money. Jiwoo was silent, his fingers drumming an irregular rhythm on the armrest of his chair. He looked bored, but Melissa knew better. Bored predators were the most dangerous kind. She approached the table from the left, keeping her movements small and deferential. In her peripheral vision, she could see one of the bodyguards tracking her progress. His hand had shifted slightly, now resting on his belt buckle. Not overtly threatening, but close enough to his weapon that he could draw in under 2 seconds if needed. "Sparkling or still, Chairman?" she asked in Korean, her accent carefully neutral. Not too polished, not too regional, just another faceless service worker in a city full of them. Chairman Ban didn't look at her. Still, room temperature. Of course. She poured with the kind of precision that came from pouring 10,000 glasses before this one. Not a drop spilled, not a sound louder than necessary. She was a ghost, a shadow, a nonentity, exactly as she needed to be. But as she moved to Jiwoo's glass, something shifted. She felt his gaze before she saw it, a physical weight that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She kept her expression blank, her hands steady, but internally she was screaming at herself to move faster, to finish and get out. "You're new," Jiwoo said. His voice was smooth, almost pleasant, but there was an edge underneath that suggested he'd already decided she was either an asset or a threat. Melissa's training kicked in. She smiled, small, polite, forgettable. "I've been here 6 months, sir." 6 months, he repeated, as if testing the words. "And yet I've never seen you before." "I usually work the main dining room. Director H. Wang assigned me here tonight." She kept pouring, kept moving. "Don't engage. Don't give him a reason to remember you." But Jiwoo wasn't finished. "You have good posture, military." The question landed like a knife between her ribs. Melissa's hand didn't shake. Years of training ensured that, but something must have flickered across her face, because Jiwoo's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Ballet," she lied smoothly. "When I was younger, my mother insisted." It was a good lie, believable, the kind of detail that would satisfy casual curiosity without inviting further investigation. She finished pouring his water and moved to the next guest, but she could still feel Jiwoo's eyes on her back. He didn't believe her. Or worse, he believed her and was intrigued anyway. Director H. Wang appeared at the edge of the lounge, his expression radiating barely contained panic. He gestured frantically for her to finish and leave. Melissa obeyed, completing the water service with the same mechanical efficiency she'd started with. As she retreated toward the partition door, she allowed herself one final glance at the table. Chairman Ban was laughing at something his guest had said, his whole face transformed by the rare expression of genuine amusement. He looked almost human in that moment, almost like the kind of grandfather who'd spoil his grandchildren with sweets and stories. It was a good mask, a necessary one for a man who'd built an empire on the bones of his enemies. And then the guest said something else, something Melissa couldn't quite hear, and Chairman Ban's laughter died. The warmth drained from his face like water from a broken glass. His hand tightened around his cane, knuckles going white. "I come from fishermen," the chairman said quietly. His voice was soft, but it carried through the lounge like a crack of thunder. "My father gutted fish on the docks of Busan for 30 years. He died with calluses on his hands and not a single one to his name. And you dare." The guest raised his hands in a placating gesture, but Melissa could see the contempt in his eyes. The barely concealed sneer that said, "You can buy all the suits you want, Ban. You'll always be a fisherman's son." Melissa should have kept walking, should have pushed through the partition door and disappeared back into the kitchen where she belonged. But something inside her, something old and stubborn and deeply, catastrophically stupid, refused to let her move. She watched Chairman Ban's face harden into something ancient and terrible. She watched Jiwoo's hand drift toward his jacket. She watched the bodyguards shift their stances, preparing for violence that would paint the VIP lounge red. And in that frozen moment, Melissa made a choice that would destroy everything. She stopped walking. She turned. And in a voice that carried the weight of 3 generations of southern kings, she bowed her head and spoke in the Gyeongsang Sadori, the dialect of her grandmother, the tongue of scholars and nobility, the language that hadn't been heard in Seoul's underworld since before the war. Jondi Hamnida, H. Webionim, Jail Myongnan Bun, I Oziatsubnika. The room turned to ice. Chairman Ban's hand froze an inch from his glass. The contemptuous guest went pale. Jiwoo's entire body went rigid, his hand now fully inside his jacket, fingers wrapped around cold steel. And Melissa, the invisible waitress, the girl who'd spent a decade perfecting the art of being nobody, felt the full weight of 20 pairs of eyes land on her like a guillotine blade. The silence that followed Melissa's words wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of something far more dangerous, recognition wrapped in disbelief, curiosity sharpened into suspicion, and beneath it all, the electric charge of imminent violence. Chairman Ban turned his head slowly, mechanically, like a man waking from a nightmare, only to discover the nightmare had followed him into consciousness. His eyes found Melissa where she stood frozen 3 steps from the partition door, her tray clutched against her chest like a flimsy shield. For a moment that stretched into eternity, he simply stared at her, his expression cycling through shock, confusion, and then something that looked disturbingly close to fear. The contemptuous guest, a man Melissa now recognized as Vice Chairman Cho of Daehan Financial Group, one of the oldest money families in Seoul, had gone from ruddy-faced arrogance to ashen disbelief. His mouth hung open in a way that would have been comical if the situation weren't careening toward catastrophe. He looked at Melissa, then at Chairman Ban, then back at Melissa, as if trying to solve an equation that refused to balance. "What did she just say?" Vice Chairman Cho whispered, though the lounge's acoustics carried his words to every corner. Chairman Ban didn't answer. He was still staring at Melissa, his weathered face now completely unreadable. The hand that had been gripping his dragon-headed cane had gone slack, and the cane itself tilted at an odd angle, forgotten. It was Jiwoo who moved first. He rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a man who'd been training for violence since childhood, his hand still inside his jacket. He didn't draw his weapon, not yet, but the threat was clear. In 3 strides he'd crossed the distance between the table and Melissa, positioning himself between her and the exit. Up close, he was even more imposing than she'd realized. The expensive cologne couldn't quite mask the scent of gun oil and something darker, more metallic. Blood, perhaps, or just the memory of it. "Say it again," Jiwoo commanded, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of an executioner's order. Melissa's training screamed at her to run, to drop the tray and bolt for the kitchen, to disappear into the Seoul night and never look back. But her feet remained rooted to the antique Persian rug, and her mouth, that treacherous, stupid mouth, opened again. "Jondi Hamnida, H. Webionim," she repeated, softer this time but with no less clarity. "I honor you greatly, Chairman. The most esteemed elder has arrived." The Gyeongsang dialect rolled off her tongue like water, each syllable weighted with centuries of tradition. It wasn't just a regional accent. It was a declaration of lineage, of belonging to a world that had supposedly died with the old Korea. Only the most educated scholars still studied it. Only the descendants of the southern aristocracy still spoke it at home, behind closed doors, where the nouveau rich couldn't hear them clinging to their fatting relevance. And certainly, no black waitress in a fusion restaurant should know it existed, let alone speak it with the fluency of someone who'd been raised in it. Jiwoo's eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. "Who taught you that?" "My grandmother," Melissa said, and it was the truth, though not the whole truth. Her grandmother had taught her many things during those precious summers in the countryside outside Jeonju, before the world had caught fire and turned her family into ghosts. But she'd also been taught by linguists at the embassy, by her father's associates who needed her to blend in anywhere, to speak any language, to become anyone. "Your grandmother," Jiwoo repeated, his tone suggesting he found this about as believable as a fish claiming it could fly. "And where is your grandmother now?" "Dead," another truth, another fragment of a larger lie. Chairman Ban finally found his voice. It emerged rough, shaken, nothing like the commanding tone he'd used moments before. "Come here, girl." It wasn't a request. Melissa's legs moved before her brain could fully process the command, carrying her toward the table where the chairman sat. The bodyguards had shifted positions, forming a tighter perimeter around the lounge. No one was getting in. More importantly, no one was getting out. As she approached, Melissa forced herself to observe details, to catalog information the way her father had taught her. Vice Chairman Cho's left hand was trembling slightly where it rested on the table. The bodyguard nearest the north entrance had adjusted his stance, weight now on his back foot, ready to move forward, not defend. And Chairman Ban's breathing had quickened, though he was trying to hide it behind the mask of composure that had served him for decades. "Set down the tray," Chairman Ban ordered. "Look at me." Melissa obeyed, placing the tray on a nearby service cart before turning to face him directly. It violated every instinct she'd cultivated over the past decade. Don't make eye contact. Don't be seen. Don't be remembered. But those rules belonged to the invisible waitress named Melissa Peacock, and that woman had just ceased to exist the moment she'd opened her mouth. Chairman Ban studied her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle. His gaze traced her features, the sharp intelligence in her eyes that the oversized glasses couldn't fully hide, the set of her jaw, the way she held herself despite the fear coursing through her veins. He was searching for something, some ghost from his past, some answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. "You speak the old tongue," he said finally. "Not the simplified version they teach in universities, the real dialect. The one my grandmother used when she wanted to remind my father of everything he'd lost when they came down from the mountains." It wasn't a question, but Melissa nodded anyway. "And you're what, 23, 24? 24. Born where?" This was the moment. The knife's edge. She could lie, construct some elaborate backstory about a Korean adoptive family, about summers spent in Jeonju learning from elderly relatives. It might even be believable enough to satisfy casual curiosity. But Chairman Ban wasn't casually curious. He was hunting, and men like him could smell a lie the way sharks smelled blood in water. "Paris," Melissa said. "But my grandmother lived in Jeonju. I spent summers there as a child." "Your grandmother's name." The tray on the service cart suddenly seemed very far away, and Melissa's hands felt empty, vulnerable. "Respectfully, Chairman, I don't see how my family history is relevant to water service." The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. Several of the bodyguards shifted, hands moving closer to concealed weapons. Vice Chairman Cho looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor, and Jiwoo, still standing close enough that Melissa could count his heartbeats in the pulse visible at his throat, smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "You speak to my father in the tongue of kings," Jiwoo said softly, "and then you tell him what is and isn't relevant. You're either extraordinarily brave or catastrophically stupid." "Perhaps both," Melissa replied before she could stop herself. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across Jiwoo's face. Surprise, maybe, or reluctant admiration. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cold mask of calculation. He turned to his father. "Abioji, let me handle this." But Chairman Ban raised a hand, silencing him. The old man's expression had shifted again, morphing from shock into something more complex. When he spoke next, his voice carried a different weight, not anger, but a kind of careful respect that hadn't been there before. "Agassi," he said, using the old form of address for a young woman of quality. "You have done something tonight that no one has dared to do in many years. You have reminded me of who I was before I became who I am." He paused, his gaze flicking briefly to Vice Chairman Cho, whose face had taken on a grayish pallor. "This man insulted my origins. He suggested that no matter how high I climb, I will always smell of fish guts and poverty, that the blood in my veins is too common, too dirty, to deserve the respect of Seoul's elite." Vice Chairman Cho started to protest, but Chairman Ban silenced him with a look that could have frozen the Han River. "And then you," Chairman Ban continued, turning back to Melissa, "you greeted me in the language of the Southern aristocracy, the language of the families who ruled before the war, before the occupation, before everything turned to ash. You called me Hwebionim, not just chairman, but honored elder. You spoke to me as if I were descended from scholars and kings." He leaned forward, and Melissa could see the scars on his knuckles, the permanent stains that no amount of expensive suits could erase. "So tell me, girl, was that kindness? Was it pity? Or are you making a point that someone like Vice Chairman Cho here is too stupid to understand? The honest answer was none of those things. Melissa had spoken without thinking, driven by a rage she thought she'd buried years ago. Rage at men like Vice Chairman Cho who wielded their inherited wealth like weapons. Rage at the casual cruelty of people who'd never gutted a fish or missed a meal or watched their entire world burn because they were born on the wrong side of someone else's ambition. But she couldn't say that. Couldn't explain that she'd seen too many chairman bans in her life, men who'd clawed their way up from nothing, only to discover that the people at the top would never let them forget where they'd started. It was respect, Melissa said finally. Genuine respect. Vice Chairman Cho's family may have old blood, but you have old strength, the kind that survives, the kind that builds empires while others simply inherit them. The words hung in the air like smoke. Vice Chairman Cho's face cycled through several shades of purple, but he kept his mouth firmly shut. He was smart enough to recognize that this conversation had moved far beyond his control. Chairman Ban sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable once more. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of dark amusement. Old strength, he repeated. I like that. He glanced at Jiwoo. What do you think, son? Should we be flattered or concerned that a waitress sees us so clearly? Concerned, Jiwoo said immediately, his eyes never leaving Melissa's face. People who see clearly are dangerous. They notice things, remember things. True, Chairman Ban agreed. He turned back to Melissa. Which raises the question, what else have you noticed? What else have you remembered about the people who dine in this restaurant? It was a trap dressed as curiosity, and Melissa knew it. If she claimed to notice nothing, she'd be lying, and Chairman Ban would know it. If she admitted to noticing everything, the clandestine meetings, the quiet exchanges of information, the careful choreography of power that played out in the Gilded Lotus every night, she'd be confessing to being a potential security threat. I noticed that Director H. Wang is probably having a heart attack right now, Melissa said, nodding toward the partition door where H. Wang's pale face was pressed against the glass. And I noticed that your water is getting warm. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Chairman Ban threw back his head and laughed, a genuine, full-throated sound that seemed to surprise even him. Chairman Ban's laughter faded, but something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. The immediate threat of violence had receded like a tide, though Melissa knew it could crash back without warning. She'd bought herself minutes, maybe an hour, but eventually someone would ask questions she couldn't answer without destroying the carefully constructed fiction of her life. Return to your duties, Chairman Ban said, waving her away with the casual dismissal of a king releasing a court jester. And send Director Uchwang in. I want to compliment him on his interesting choice of staff. The words were polite, but the underlying message was clear. I'm not done with you yet. Melissa bowed, a proper bow, not too deep, not too shallow, and retreated toward the partition door. She could feel multiple gazes tracking her movement, cataloging the way she walked, the angle of her shoulders, the controlled precision of her steps. Joa's eyes felt the heaviest, a physical weight pressing against her spine like the barrel of a gun. Director Uchwang practically yanked her through the partition door the moment she was within reach. His hands were shaking, and his face had gone from pale to a mottled red that suggested his blood pressure had achieved numbers usually reserved for medical emergencies. What did you do? He hissed, pulling her into the narrow corridor that led to the kitchen. What in God's name did you do in there? I served water, Melissa said, keeping her voice steady. The chairman laughed. I believe that's considered a successful service interaction. Don't. Uchwang's finger jabbed toward her face, stopping just short of touching her nose. Don't you dare play games with me. Chairman Ban wants to see me, personally. Do you have any idea what that means? It means you should probably fix your tie and wipe the sweat off your face before you go in, Melissa suggested, which earned her a look of such pure hatred that she almost felt bad for the man. Almost. Uchwang stormed back toward the VIP lounge, muttering what sounded like prayers or curses under his breath. Melissa watched him go, then turned toward the kitchen. She needed to move, to do something with her hands before the adrenaline crash hit and her carefully maintained composure crumbled. The kitchen was still in controlled chaos. Line cooks shouted orders while Sue's chefs plated dishes with the kind of precision usually reserved for surgery. The air was thick with steam and the competing aromas of a dozen different courses in various stages of preparation. No one looked at Melissa as she entered. In the hierarchy of the kitchen, waitstaff occupied the lowest rung, necessary but largely invisible. She grabbed an empty tray from the service station and began loading it with dirty glasses that had been left by the polishing station. Busy work. Mindless, repetitive busy work that gave her brain something to focus on besides the catastrophic mistake she'd just made. Her hands moved automatically, stacking glasses in the precise configuration that would prevent them from clinking together during transport. "You're doing it wrong." The voice came from behind her, close enough that she could feel the breath against her ear. Melissa didn't jump. Years of training had long since beaten the startle reflex out of her. But she did freeze, her fingers tightening around the glass she'd been holding. Bun Joa stood less than 2 feet away, having somehow crossed the entire kitchen without her noticing. Up close, without the formal barrier of the VIP lounge between them, he was even more unsettling. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they held the kind of cold intelligence that suggested he'd seen through every lie she'd ever told before she'd even opened her mouth. "Excuse me," Melissa said, not turning around. If she turned, she'd have to look at him, and looking at him meant acknowledging that he'd invaded her space, her sanctuary, the one place in the restaurant where she should have been safe from scrutiny. "Your stance," Joa said, moving to her side so she couldn't avoid seeing him without making it obvious she was avoiding him. Weight distributed 50-50 between both feet, knees slightly bent, shoulders squared, center of gravity low. He tilted his head, studying her the way a jeweler might study a diamond, looking for flaws or proof of authenticity. That's not how waitresses stand. That's how soldiers stand. That's how people have been trained to move quickly, to react to threats, to survive combat stand. Melissa set down the glass she'd been holding with deliberate care. "I took a self-defense class at university. Women traveling alone need to know how to protect themselves." "A self-defense class," Joa repeated, his tone making it clear he found this explanation about as convincing as Vice Chairman Chuz's stammered apologies. "And which university was that?" "Sorbonne," Melissa said, because it was true enough to be checkable and vague enough to be unhelpful. "Paris campus, 3 years ago." "The Sorbonne offers excellent self-defense classes," Joa said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than circling each other like predators establishing territory. "Basic striking techniques, how to break a grip, how to use everyday objects as improvised weapons, very practical curriculum." He paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. "But they don't teach you how to assess a room's tactical layout in under 3 seconds. They don't teach you how to identify armed personnel by the slight bulge under their jackets or the way they keep their strong hand free. And they certainly don't teach you the Gyeongsang dialect spoken by families who died before you were born." Melissa's pulse was hammering in her throat, but she kept her expression neutral, bored even. "I'm a good student. I pay attention." "You're more than a good student." Joa reached past her, picking up one of the glasses she'd been stacking. He held it up to the light, examining it as if it held secrets. "You're a woman who speaks 5 languages. I counted the switching between Korean, English, and Japanese during dinner service, plus the French you just claimed and the ancient dialect that stopped my father's heart. You're a woman who moves like violence is just another word in your vocabulary. And you're a woman who's working as a waitress in Seoul, when you could clearly be doing something far more profitable with your skill set." He set the glass down and turned to face her fully. "So let's stop pretending you're just a well-educated server who happened to remember a few phrases from her grandmother. Tell me who you really are, or I'll have one of my people run your fingerprints and find out myself." The threat was delivered without malice, without raised voice or physical intimidation. That somehow made it worse. Joa wasn't angry, he was curious, and curious predators were patient. They'd wait hours, days, weeks if necessary to satisfy that curiosity. "I'm exactly who I appear to be," Melissa said, meeting his gaze for the first time since he'd entered the kitchen. "A woman who needed a job and was good at carrying plates without dropping them." "No," Joa said softly. "You're a woman who's hiding. I recognize the signs because I've spent my entire life watching people hide from my family, but most of them aren't nearly as good at it as you are. He leaned closer, close enough that she could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the result of what must have been a vicious fight years ago. Which makes me wonder what you're hiding from, or who. Before Melissa could formulate a response that wouldn't dig her grave any deeper, the kitchen's back door swung open with a bang that made half the line cooks jump. Da-hun burst through, his face flushed from the cold and excitement. "Did you hear?" he said to no one in particular and everyone at once. "There's a protest blocking traffic on Gangnam Boulevard, some kind of labor demonstration. The entire street is gridlocked." One of the other cooks groaned. "That's going to mess up our supply deliveries." "Forget the deliveries," Da-hun said, pulling off his jacket. "Half the servers can't get here for the late shift. Director Uchwung is about to have an aneurysm." Joa's attention shifted slightly, his head turning toward the noise though his body remained oriented toward Melissa. It was a small opening, a fraction of distraction, but it was enough. She took 2 steps backward, putting the service cart between them, creating distance that felt necessary for breathing. "I should get these glasses to the washing station," she said, gripping the edges of the tray. "We're not finished talking," Joa said, his focus snapping back to her with predatory precision. "I have work to do. Your father requested premium sake service in 30 minutes, and Director Uchweng will actually have that aneurysm if I'm not there to pour it." It was a gamble, invoking his father's name as a shield. But Joa hesitated, some internal calculation running behind his dark eyes. Finally, he stepped aside, giving her just enough room to pass with the tray. "This conversation isn't over," he said as she moved past him. "I'm going to find out who you are, Melissa Peacock, and when I do, I'll decide whether you're an asset or a threat." "And if I'm a threat?" Melissa asked, against every instinct screaming at her to shut up and walk away. Jiwoo's smile was thin, cold, and utterly without humor. "Then I'll make sure you disappear so thoroughly that not even your grandmother's ghost will be able to find you." Melissa didn't respond. She carried the tray toward the washing station, her steps measured and controlled, her breathing carefully regulated. She didn't look back. Didn't need to. She could feel Jiwoo's gaze boring into her back like a brand, marking her as something that required further investigation. The washing station was in a narrow alcove near the walk-in freezer, partially hidden from the main kitchen by a wall of industrial shelving. Melissa set down her tray and braced her hands against the steel counter, finally allowing herself a moment of weakness. Her hands were shaking. Not much, but enough that she had to curl them into fists to make it stop. She'd survived. She talked her way through a minefield of questions and implications without triggering an immediate execution. But surviving wasn't the same as winning. Jiwoo suspected her. Chairman Ban was interested in her, and interest from men like the Bans was a death sentence in slow motion. The freezer door opened behind her with a hiss of pneumatic hinges. Melissa spun, her hand already reaching for the paring knife she kept tucked in her apron pocket, a habit from too many dangerous kitchens in too many dangerous cities. But it was just one of the prep cooks, a young guy named Min Jun who barely looked old enough to shave, backing out with a crate of frozen scallops. "Sorry," he muttered, not really looking at her. "Didn't know anyone was back here." He shuffled away, and Melissa forced herself to breathe, to uncurl her fingers from around the knife handle, to remember that not every shadow held a threat, not every opening door concealed an ambush. But old habits died hard, and instincts carved into her bones by violence and necessity didn't care about logic or statistical probability. They only cared about survival. And right now, her survival instincts were screaming that she'd made a fatal mistake. That speaking in the chairman's dialect, revealing even a fragment of her training, had painted a target on her back that no amount of invisible waitress camouflage could hide. The sake service went exactly as protocol demanded. Melissa poured with the measured precision of a tea ceremony master, keeping her eyes appropriately downcast while Chairman Ban and his guests discussed matters that should have been incomprehensible to a mere waitress. Port acquisitions, political appointments, the delicate art of persuading judges to see reason. She heard everything and gave no indication she understood any of it. Jiwoo watched her the entire time. Not obviously, he was too well trained for that, but she could feel the weight of his attention like static electricity before a lightning strike. Every movement she made was being cataloged, analyzed, compared against some internal database of threats and anomalies. When she finished and retreated to the service corridor, Melissa allowed herself exactly 30 seconds to lean against the wall and close her eyes. 30 seconds to acknowledge the exhaustion creeping through her bones, the fear coiled in her gut like razor wire. Then she straightened, adjusted her apron, and returned to the choreographed dance of service. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of courses, each one more elaborate than the last, each requiring its own specialized presentation. Melissa moved through the routine on autopilot, her body executing practiced movements while her mind worked furiously on an exit strategy. She could disappear tonight, grab her go-bag from the cramped studio apartment she rented in Hongdae, catch the last KTX to Busan, and be on a boat to Japan by dawn. She'd done it before, could do it again. But something made her hesitate. Some stubborn, self-destructive part of her that refused to run until she absolutely had to. The explosion answered that question with brutal finality. The sound hit first, not the Hollywood fireball boom, but something sharper, more percussive, like the world's largest champagne bottle being uncorked directly into her eardrums. The VIP lounge's reinforced windows absorbed most of the blast, spiderwebbing with cracks but not shattering. The shockwave followed half a heartbeat later, a wall of pressure that knocked Melissa off her feet and sent her sliding across the polished floor. Her training kicked in before conscious thought. Even as she was falling, she was analyzing. The blast had come from below, basement level, probably the wine cellar. Not military-grade explosives, the pressure wave was wrong, too diffuse. Homemade device, likely fertilizer-based, designed to cause chaos more than casualties, which meant this wasn't random terrorism. This was a distraction. Melissa's ears were ringing, but she forced herself to focus past the high-pitched whine. In the VIP lounge, Chairman Ban had been thrown backward in his chair, which had probably saved his life. The trajectory put him below the sight line of the shattered window. Jiwoo was already moving, his weapon drawn, shouting orders to the bodyguards. Vice Chairman Cho was curled on the floor, hands over his head, making high-pitched whimpering sounds that would haunt his social standing for years. But it was the bodyguards' positions that sent ice through Melissa's veins. They'd formed a protective perimeter around the table, which made tactical sense in most situations. But they'd clustered too close together, creating overlapping fields of fire that looked secure on paper but actually created a massive vulnerability. Any operator with basic training could see it. The angles were wrong. The coverage had gaps. And most damning of all, the bodyguard covering the northwest corner, a thick-necked man with a scar running down his jaw, had shifted his stance. His weapon wasn't pointed outward toward potential threats. It was angled inward, toward Chairman Ban. The dead zone. That's what her father had called it. The moment when protective formations became kill boxes, when the people meant to shield you became the weapons pointed at your heart. Melissa saw the scarred bodyguard's finger tighten on the trigger, saw Jiwoo's attention focused on the shattered window, his back to the real threat. Saw Chairman Ban struggling to stand, completely exposed, 3 seconds from death. She moved. Later, Melissa wouldn't remember making the decision. Wouldn't remember the rational calculation of risk versus reward, the careful weighing of consequences. She would only remember the pure, instinctive drive to prevent what she'd seen too many times before, the moment when trust transformed into betrayal, when loyalty revealed itself as a mask worn by assassination. The serving tray she dropped when the explosion hit was still spinning on the floor. Melissa grabbed it as she launched herself toward Chairman Ban, her body moving with a kind of speed that only came from thousands of hours of muscle memory training. The tray was solid silver, heavy enough to serve as an improvised shield, and she got it between Chairman Ban and the bodyguard's weapon just as the first shot cracked through the air. The bullet hit the tray with a sound like a church bell being struck by a hammer. The impact jolted up Melissa's arms, nearly tearing the tray from her grip, but she held on. Used the momentum to ram into Chairman Ban, shoving him sideways and down behind the overturned table. A second shot rang out, passing through the space where the chairman's head had been a fraction of a second earlier. "Stay down," Melissa shouted in Korean, pressing her weight against Chairman Ban to keep him pinned to the floor. She could feel his heart hammering against her arm, could smell the expensive cologne mixed with the acrid stench of fierce sweat. The room erupted into chaos. Jiwoo spun, his weapon tracking toward the scarred bodyguard, but two other guards had already realized what was happening. They opened fire, their shots going wide in the cramped space, punching holes in the antique wallpaper and turning the lounge into a shooting gallery. The scarred bodyguard, the traitor, dove behind a decorative pillar, returning fire with the kind of practiced accuracy that spoke to military training. He wasn't trying to kill Chairman Ban anymore. His escape had become the priority. But he was laying down enough suppressive fire to make pursuit suicide. Melissa's mind worked at triple speed, cataloging details. 3 loyal bodyguards down, wounded or dead. 2 more pinned behind furniture. Unable to advance without exposing themselves. Jiwoo moving toward the traitor's position with a kind of cold determination that suggested he planned to empty an entire magazine into the man's face. And Chairman Ban beneath her, still alive, still breathing, but only because a waitress who shouldn't know how to read tactical formations had recognized a kill box before it closed. "Abioji," Jiwoo's voice cut through the gunfire. "Are you hit?" "No," Chairman Ban wheezed. His hands had grabbed onto Melissa's uniform jacket, gripping the fabric with desperate strength. "The girl, she pushed me." Another explosion, smaller this time, came from the main dining room. Screams followed, high and panicked. The sound of breaking glass, running feet, the particular chaos that came when civilians encountered violence they'd only seen in movies. "We need to move," Melissa said, her voice calm despite the adrenaline turning her blood into rocket fuel. "They're herding everyone toward the south exit. It's a kill funnel. Anyone who goes that way is dead." Jiwoo had reached the pillar where the traitor had taken cover. He moved with the economical violence of someone who'd done this before, rounding the corner with his weapon raised. The shot he fired was followed by a wet, choking sound. When Jiwoo stepped back, his expression was utterly blank, and there was blood misted across his white shirt cuff. He crossed back to where Melissa still covered his father, his eyes finding hers with an intensity that felt like physical contact. "How did you know?" "His stance was wrong," Melissa said. "Weight forward, weapon angle inward. He was preparing to fire on the chairman, not defend him. And you just happened to notice that while serving sake." "I notice a lot of things." Jiwoo stared at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his dark eyes. Then he extended his hand, pulling Chairman Ban to his feet with surprising gentleness. The old man was shaking, his carefully constructed composure finally cracking under the weight of narrowly avoided death. "Someone inside," Chairman Ban said, his voice hoarse. "Someone close enough to turn my own security against me." "I'll find them," Jiwoo promised, and the cold certainty in his voice suggested that whoever had orchestrated this betrayal would beg for death long before he granted it. A third explosion, this one from the kitchen, sent tremors through the floor. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in sickly red that made the blood splattered across the walls look black. "We can't stay here," Melissa said. She'd released Chairman Ban but remained in a crouch, her body instinctively seeking the smallest target profile. "The explosions are sequential, methodical. They're collapsing your escape routes one by one. In about 90 seconds, the only way out will be the route they want you to take." "The underground parking garage," Jiwoo said immediately. "There's a private elevator." "Which they'll have covered." Melissa closed her eyes, rebuilding the restaurant's layout in her mind. She'd memorized it weeks ago, the same way she memorized every building she spent significant time in. Emergency exits, structural weaknesses, routes that didn't appear on official blueprints. The old service tunnel, the one they sealed off during renovations 3 years ago. Jiwoo's head snapped toward her. "How do you know about that?" "Because I pay attention," Melissa said, "and because I've seen building permits filed with the city. The tunnel connects to the adjacent property's basement, the office building on the corner. They never properly sealed it, just put up drywall and pretended it didn't exist. That tunnel hasn't been used in years. It could be structurally unsound. It's also the only route they won't have covered because officially it doesn't exist." Melissa looked at Chairman Ban, whose face had gone gray in the emergency lighting. "Can you run?" The old man straightened, Some of his iron will reasserting itself. I've run from worse. Then we move, now. Jiwoo looked like he wanted to argue, wanted to demand more explanations for how a waitress knew things she shouldn't know, could do things she shouldn't be able to do. But the sound of booted feet in the corridor made the decision for him. Lead the way, he said, his weapon trained on the door. But if this is a trap... If this is a trap, we're all already dead, Melissa interrupted. So let's make sure it's not. She grabbed Chairman Ban's arm, supporting his weight as they moved toward the service corridor. Behind them, Jiwoo provided rear security, his movements fluid and professional. The remaining loyal bodyguards fell in around them, creating a loose protective formation that was probably the best they could manage under the circumstances. The emergency lighting cast their shadows long and distorted against the walls as they ran. Somewhere in the restaurant, more gunfire erupted. More screams. The methodical destruction of everything the Gilded Lotus had pretended to be, a sanctuary for the wealthy, a place where power could dine in peace. But Melissa had learned long ago that there were no sanctuaries, only temporary shelters from storms that never really stopped. The service tunnel entrance was hidden behind a false wall in the prep kitchen's dry storage room, exactly where Melissa remembered it from the architectural records she'd accessed during her 3rd week at the Gilded Lotus. Breaking into the city planning office's database had been almost embarrassingly easy, a reminder that Seoul's bureaucracy, for all its modern efficiency, still relied on security systems designed by the lowest bidder. She shoved aside industrial-sized containers of flour and rice, her hands moving with purposeful urgency while Jiwoo kept his weapon trained on the corridor behind them. Chairman Ban was breathing hard, one hand pressed against his ribs where he'd hit the floor. He hadn't complained, hadn't slowed them down, but Melissa could see pain etched into the lines around his mouth. Here, she said, finding the seam in the drywall. The contractors had done a decent job concealing it, but they'd used different screws than the rest of the wall, a small inconsistency that most people would never notice. Melissa wasn't most people. Jiwoo appeared at her shoulder. We need tools too. Melissa drove her elbow into the drywall. Once, twice, 3 times. The material cracked, then crumbled, revealing the darkness beyond. She'd positioned her strikes precisely, targeting the weakest points where the drywall met the frame. It was louder than she would have liked, but stealth had stopped being an option the moment the first bomb went off. Or we could do it that way, Jiwoo said, his tone suggesting he was rapidly revising every assumption he'd made about her. After you, Melissa said, pulling away chunks of drywall to widen the opening. Jiwoo hesitated for exactly 1 heartbeat before shaking his head. No, you go first. If this is an ambush, I want to see who's waiting on the other side before my father enters. It was a test, a way of determining whether Melissa was leading them to safety or delivering them to whoever had orchestrated tonight's massacre. She met his gaze steadily, then crawled through the opening without argument. Testing took time, and time was a luxury they'd exhausted about 3 explosions ago. The tunnel was exactly as dark as she'd expected and smelled of mildew and ancient concrete. Her eyes adjusted quickly, another gift from her father's brutal training regimen. She could make out the rough dimensions, maybe 5 feet wide, 7 feet high, stretching into blackness that could hide anything. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a rhythmic plinking that made her think of funeral bells. Clear, she called back softly. Chairman Ban came through next, moving with surprising agility for a man his age. Jiwoo followed, pulling out his phone and activating its flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing walls covered in old graffiti and what might have been water damage or might have been something more concerning. The floor was uneven, broken in places, but navigable if they were careful. This way, Melissa said, orienting herself. The tunnel ran perpendicular to the main restaurant structure, angling slightly downward as it connected to the adjacent building's foundation. She'd studied the plans carefully enough to walk it blindfolded, though she'd hoped to never test that particular skill. They moved in single file, Melissa leading, Chairman Ban in the middle, Jiwoo bringing up the rear with his weapon and phone. The sound of their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, making it impossible to tell if they were being followed. Every 20 feet or so, Melissa would stop and listen, her head cocked. But she heard nothing except their breathing, and that persistent dripping. "Why are you helping us?" Chairman Ban asked after they'd been walking for perhaps 5 minutes. His voice was steady now, the shock of the attack metabolized into something harder, more focused. "Because people were shooting at you, and I was in the way," Melissa said without turning around. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have right now." Behind them, Jiwoo made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something darker. "You're lying. People don't risk their lives for strangers. They especially don't risk their lives for men like my father unless they want something. Maybe I just don't like seeing people get shot." "Then you chose the wrong restaurant to work at," Jiwoo said. "The Gilded Lotus caters to exactly the kind of people who get shot, regularly." Melissa didn't respond. She'd reached a junction where the tunnel split into 2 directions, one continuing straight toward what should be the adjacent building, the other branching off to the right toward what looked like an older section of Seoul's infrastructure. The straight path was the logical choice, the safer choice. Which was exactly why Melissa stopped and studied the right-hand branch. "Problem?" Jiwoo asked, moving up beside her. In the phone's glow, his face was all harsh angles and deep shadows. "The main tunnel will exit in the office building's basement," Melissa said. "Standard security there. Cameras, maybe a night guard. If your attackers did their homework, and they clearly did, they'll have someone positioned there." "And the other pass?" "Old storm drain system. Predates most of the modern construction. Connects to the subway maintenance tunnels about 300 meters north of here." She paused, considering. "Also a good chance it's flooded, structurally compromised, or home to things that bite." Chairman Ban made a sound that might have been dark amusement. "And you know this how?" "Because I make it my business to know how to disappear from any building I spend time in," Melissa said, and it was true enough to satisfy casual scrutiny even if it omitted decades of context. Jiwoo studied her profile in the dim light. "The storm drains," he said finally. "If they did their homework, they'd expect us to take the obvious route." They took the right branch. The tunnel narrowed almost immediately, forcing them to move in a crouch. The smell intensified, not just mildew now, but something organic and rotting. Melissa tried not to think about what might be decomposing in the darkness. The walls here were older, brick instead of concrete, and the mortar between them had crumbled in places. Water seeped through the cracks, making the floor treacherous. 20 meters in, they heard it. Voices, coming from behind them from the direction of the Gilded Lotus. Tunnel entrance in the storage room, found fresh damage to the wall. Then they went this way. Move. Jiwoo killed his phone's flashlight instantly, plunging them into absolute darkness. Melissa felt Chairman Ban's hand grip her shoulder, using her as an anchor point. She could hear all 3 of them breathing, carefully controlled but impossible to eliminate entirely. "We need to move," Jiwoo whispered, barely audible. "Now." They did, navigating by touch and memory in darkness so complete it felt solid. Melissa kept one hand on the wall, using the texture of the brick to track their progress. Behind them, flashlight beams began probing the tunnel. The voices grew closer. "I count 3 sets of tracks in the dust. They definitely came this way. Could be anyone, workers, maintenance. With fresh blood on the walls, don't be stupid, it's them." Melissa's mind caught on that last part. Blood on the walls. She glanced back, though she could see nothing in the darkness. One of them must be wounded, probably Chairman Ban, from when he'd hit the floor. He hadn't mentioned it, hadn't complained, but men like Ban were experts at hiding weakness until hiding it became impossible. The tunnel curved ahead, and Melissa nearly stumbled over something in the darkness. Her hand shot out, finding cold metal. A ladder bolted into the brick wall, leading upward. "Here," she whispered. Jiwoo's hand found the ladder a second later. "Where does this go?" "Up. Does it matter?" "It matters if we climb into a dead end." "Then stay down here and get shot. I'm going up." Melissa started climbing before he could argue. The ladder was slick with condensation, each rung a potential catastrophe, but she moved with practiced efficiency. Above her, after perhaps 20 feet, her hands found a metal grate. She pushed against it experimentally. It didn't budge. Below, the flashlight beams were getting brighter. She could hear boots splashing through puddles, could hear someone giving orders in a voice she almost recognized. Not quite, but close enough to trigger alarm bells in her memory. Melissa braced her back against the tunnel wall and drove both feet into the grate. Once. Twice. On the third strike, something gave with a shriek of protesting metal. The grate shifted, creating an opening large enough to squeeze through. She emerged into what appeared to be an alley, though the darkness made it hard to be certain. The air was cold, clean, carrying the smell of trash and car exhaust instead of rot and mildew. City air. Beautiful, toxic city air. Chairman Ban came through next, moving slower now, definitely favoring his left side. Jiwoo followed, his weapon out again, scanning their surroundings with trained efficiency. They were in a narrow service alley between two buildings, perhaps half a kilometer from the Gilded Lotus based on Melissa's mental map. Close enough to still hear sirens converging on the restaurant, far enough that the immediate danger had receded. "We need a vehicle," Jiwoo said, pulling out his phone. "I'll call." "Don't." Melissa's hand shot out, knocking the phone away before he could complete the action. It clattered against the pavement, screen flickering. "Your communications are compromised. That's how they knew where to position the explosions, when to trigger them. Someone inside your organization has been feeding them information." "That's impossible," Jiwoo said, but his hand hadn't moved toward the fallen phone. "My security team is vetted, loyalty tested." Then explain how attackers knew the exact layout of the VIP lounge's sightlines. Explain how they knew which bodyguard would have a clear shot at your father. Explain how they knew the timing of every course, every movement, every. A car appeared at the alley's mouth, not emerging slowly, not cautiously approaching. It materialized from the street beyond with the kind of aggressive certainty that suggested the driver knew exactly where they were going. The headlights pinned the three of them like insects on display. Jiwoo raised his weapon, but Melissa had already moved. She recognized the engine sound, the particular stance of the vehicle. A Mercedes G-Class, armored, probably weighing close to 4 tons with all the modifications. The kind of car that could ram through a building and come out the other side with scratched paint. The rear door opened before the vehicle fully stopped. A man emerged, mid-50s, wearing the kind of black tactical gear that suggested military background but no official affiliation. His face was weathered, scarred, familiar in a way that made Melissa's stomach drop. "Get in," the man said in Korean. Then his eyes found Melissa and something flickered across his expression. Surprise, maybe. Recognition, definitely. I know you." "I don't think so," Melissa said, but she did. Oh God, she did. She knew him from 8 years ago, from a safe house in Manila where her father had hidden them during the worst of the fallout. This was Seo Tae-min, former ROK Special Forces, current head of Chairman Ban's external security operations. Which meant, "It's secure," Seo said, addressing Jiwoo. "I have 3 more teams creating a perimeter. We need to move before they realize you made it out." Jiwoo didn't lower his weapon. "How did you find us?" "I didn't, she did." Seo gestured toward Melissa. "I had eyes on all the probable exit points. When I saw someone emerge from a storm drain that shouldn't exist, I took a chance." It made sense, almost, but something in Seo's tone, in the way he was carefully not looking at Melissa now, set off every alarm bell in her head. "The chairman needs medical attention," Melissa said, pivoting. "His ribs. The fall might have caused internal bleeding." Chairman Ban waved her off with surprising irritation. "I've survived worse than falling down." "You've also never been shot at by your own security before," Melissa countered. "This wasn't random. This was coordinated, professional, and it almost worked because someone very close to you very badly wants you dead." The words hung in the air like smoke. Chairman Ban's expression hardened, aging him a decade in seconds. "Then we find out who, and we make them regret every breath they've taken since birth." "Abioji," Jiwoo said quietly. "Get in the car. We'll discuss retribution after you're safe." Chairman Ban hesitated, then nodded. He moved toward the Mercedes, Jiwoo supporting him, leaving Melissa standing in the alley with Seo. "You shouldn't be here," Seo said, his voice pitched low enough that the others wouldn't hear. "Your father paid a lot of money to make sure you'd never be here." "My father's dead," Melissa said flatly. "Which is why you should have stayed dead too." Sio's hand moved, subtle but unmistakable, coming to rest near his sidearm. Do yourself a favor. Disappear, tonight, before someone realizes who you really are. Is that a threat? It's advice from someone who knew your father. He'd want you safe, not caught up in whatever vendetta is playing out in the Ban family. Sio glanced toward the Merceds, where Jiwoo was helping his father into the back seat. That boy in there, he's going to run your fingerprints. He's going to find the red file, and when he does, your father's sacrifice will have been for nothing. Before Melissa could respond, Jiwoo called out, Are you coming or staying? The question hung in the cold air. Melissa looked at Sio, whose expression was carefully neutral now, professional mask back in place. Then she looked at the Merceds, at Jiwoo silhouetted in the interior light, at Chairman Ban who'd nearly died because she'd seen a threat no one else had noticed. She'd spent 10 years running, 10 years building walls between herself and the past, 10 years pretending to be invisible. And in one night, one moment of speaking a forgotten dialect, she'd demolished all of it. I'm coming, Melissa said, and walked toward the car before she could change her mind. The Ban family estate sat in the hills north of Seoul, far enough from the city's sprawl that the light pollution faded into something approximating natural darkness. The Merceds climbed through switchback roads carved into the mountainside, passing through 3 separate security checkpoints before the main house came into view. Each checkpoint had been staffed with men whose eyes held the flat, assessing quality of professional killers. Each had waved them through only after biometric confirmation, and what Melissa suspected were duress code verifications. The house itself was a study in contrasts, traditional Hanok architecture on the outside, all elegant curved roofs and natural materials, but the windows were bulletproof, and the decorative latticework concealed motion sensors sophisticated enough to detect a mouse at 50 meters. It was beautiful in the way a perfectly designed weapon was beautiful. Form serving function serving survival. Chairman Ban had said nothing during the 40-minute drive, his face carved from stone, his breathing carefully controlled. But Melissa had seen the way his hand kept returning to his ribs, had noticed the slight wince each time the car took a turn too sharply. Internal injuries, almost certainly. Maybe cracked ribs, maybe worse. Men his age didn't bounce back from violent impacts the way they had in their youth, no matter how much pride insisted otherwise. The car pulled into an underground garage that could have housed 20 vehicles and currently held perhaps a dozen, everything from bulletproof sedans to what looked like a modified tactical transport. Jiwoo was out before the engine died, barking orders into his phone in rapid-fire Korean that suggested he was coordinating a response that would be both comprehensive and brutal. Sio appeared at Melissa's door, opening it with a kind of careful courtesy that didn't quite mask the warning in his eyes. She ignored him and followed Chairman Ban toward an elevator that required both palm print and retinal scan to activate. The technology was military-grade, the kind of security usually reserved for government facilities or black sites that didn't officially exist. The elevator rose smoothly and silently. Chairman Ban studied his reflection in the polished steel doors, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. You saved my life tonight. It wasn't a question, but Melissa answered anyway. I saw an opening, I moved. Anyone would have done the same. No, Chairman Ban said. They wouldn't. Most people freeze when violence erupts. Their brains lock, their bodies betray them, and they die wondering why their legs wouldn't run. He turned to look at her directly. You didn't freeze. You read the tactical situation faster than my own son, identified a threat my trained bodyguards missed, and executed a response that required split-second timing. That's not luck. That's training. The elevator doors opened onto a hallway that managed to be both opulent and sterile. Artwork that probably cost more than Melissa would earn in 10 lifetimes hung on walls monitored by cameras small enough to hide in the light fixtures. They passed through another biometric checkpoint, this one staffed by a woman whose eyes were cold and professional as she logged their entry. Guest suite, Chairman Ban said to her. Medical team for me, and someone tell my son I want a full briefing in 30 minutes. The woman nodded and spoke quietly into a concealed microphone. Within seconds, 2 more security personnel appeared, flanking Chairman Ban as he was escorted toward what Melissa assumed was a private medical facility. He moved with the rigid dignity of a man refusing to acknowledge pain, his back straight despite everything. Jiwoo appeared from a side corridor, his expression dark. The girl stays in a monitored room until we know who she is. The girl has a name, Melissa said, her tone sharp despite the exhaustion pulling at her bones. And the girl would like to go home, take a very long shower, and pretend tonight never happened. That's not an option. Jiwoo's hand closed around her upper arm, not bruising, but firm enough to make his point clear. You're either an asset we need to understand or a threat we need to eliminate, until I know which. You're not going anywhere. He guided her down another corridor, this one less ornate, more functional. The room he deposited her in was comfortable enough, tasteful furniture, attached bathroom, a window that offered a view of the gardens below. It was also very clearly a cell. The door locked from the outside. The window didn't open. And the cameras in the corners were obvious enough to send a message. We're watching. Make yourself comfortable, Jiwoo said from the doorway. Someone will bring you food and clean clothes, and I'll need your cooperation with something. My cooperation? Your fingerprints. He pulled a small digital scanner from his pocket. Standard security protocol. Everyone who enters the estate gets printed. It was a lie, or at least a significant distortion of the truth, but Melissa had run out of options for resistance. She extended her hand, letting him press her fingers against the scanner's surface one by one. The device beeped softly with each print, storing data that would be run through databases she couldn't begin to guess at. How long am I staying in this very comfortable prison? Melissa asked as he finished. Until I decide you're not a threat. Jiwoo slipped the scanner back into his pocket. Or until I confirm that you are one. He left without waiting for a response. The lock clicked with a finality that made Melissa's chest tighten. She walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass, looking out at gardens illuminated by subtle landscape lighting. Beautiful, trapped, a gilded cage that was still a cage. She should be planning an escape, cataloging the room's vulnerabilities, identifying potential weapons, calculating the distance to the perimeter fence and the likelihood of making it past Ban's security. Instead, she found herself sinking into an armchair near the window, her body finally acknowledging the toll of the past few hours. Her hands were shaking. Not much, but enough that she had to curl them into fists to make it stop. Someone knocked 30 minutes later. A young woman entered carrying a tray of food, rice, soup, banchan that looked homemade, and a neatly folded set of clothes. She set everything on the low table near the armchair and left without speaking, though her eyes had taken in everything about Melissa with the kind of observation that suggested she was more than just household staff. Melissa forced herself to eat, knowing she'd need the energy regardless of what came next. The food was excellent, which somehow made everything worse. She was being treated like an honored guest rather than a prisoner, which meant Chairman Ban was still deciding what to do with her. The moment that decision shifted from gratitude to suspicion, the quality of her accommodations would be the least of her concerns. She just finished changing into the provided clothes, comfortable loungewear that fit surprisingly well, when the door opened again. Jiwoo entered, his expression unreadable, carrying a tablet. He didn't sit, didn't make himself comfortable, just stood in the center of the room like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. Tell me about your father, he said. Melissa's stomach dropped. What about him? His name was Damien Peacock, British Diplomatic Corps, officially. Unofficially, he ran intelligence operations across Asia for the better part of 2 decades, specialized in infiltrating organized crime networks, collecting blackmail material on people who thought they were untouchable. Jiwoo's eyes never left her face. And 15 years ago, he collected something on my family, something my father decided couldn't be allowed to exist. The words landed like physical blows. Melissa kept her expression neutral through sheer force of will, but inside she was screaming. They knew, of course they knew. The moment Jiwoo had taken her fingerprints, she'd signed her own death warrant. Your fingerprints came back with an interesting flag, Jiwoo continued. Red file classification, reserved for individuals who pose existential threats to national security, or, in certain cases, to families wealthy enough to have their own classification systems. Your file was sealed 15 years ago, right after your father died in what was officially ruled an accidental house fire in Paris. It was an accident, Melissa said, and her voice only shook slightly. It was an execution, Jiwoo corrected. A professional one, designed to look like faulty wiring but actually a triggered incendiary device. Your father died, your mother died, but you, he tilted his head. You disappeared, vanished so completely that even our best investigators assumed you died in the fire too. Maybe I did. Don't insult my intelligence. Jiwoo set the tablet on the table, screen facing up. The display showed a file photo of a young girl, maybe 13, with serious eyes and her mother's smile. This is you. Melissa Peacock, age 13, photographed at the British Embassy in Seoul 3 months before your parents were killed. Fluent in 7 languages. IQ tested at 156. Trained in multiple martial arts by embassy security staff who thought they were just keeping you occupied during summer breaks. He swiped to another image, this one more recent, grainier, taken from security footage. And this is you last year in Tokyo. Different hair, different name, but same biometric markers. You were working at a hotel that catered to Yakuza leadership. Stayed 6 months, then disappeared. I like to travel, Melissa said. See the world, experience different cultures. You like to hide, Jiwoo countered. You've spent the last decade building and abandoning identities, working jobs that give you access to dangerous people while keeping you invisible. Why? Maybe I just have a terrible employment record. Jiwoo's jaw tightened. My father ordered the hit on your parents. I was 12 years old, but I remember the night he came home, poured himself whiskey with shaking hands, and told my mother he'd done something that would either save or destroy our family. I didn't understand what he meant then, but I understand now. He pulled out a chair and sat, finally, bringing himself closer to Melissa's eye level. Your father had evidence, something that could have dismantled everything my family built. My father made a choice, kill one family to save his own. And now, 15 years later, that dead man's daughter appears in our restaurant, speaks a dialect she shouldn't know, saves my father's life, and expects me to believe it's all just coincidence. I didn't know who you were when I applied for the job, Melissa said, and it was true. Mostly. She'd known the Gilded Lotus catered to dangerous clientele, but she hadn't known the Ban family were regulars until her 2nd week. By then, leaving would have attracted more attention than staying. But you figured it out. Yes. And you stayed anyway. I needed the job. You could have gotten a job anywhere. Your skills, real skills, not the Waitress act, could have earned you 10 times what you're making carrying plates. Jiwoo leaned forward. So why stay? Why put yourself in the same room as the family that murdered your parents? Unless. He trailed off, something clicking into place behind his eyes. Something that made his hand drift toward his concealed weapon. Unless you were waiting, he finished softly. Waiting for an opportunity. Tonight, during the attack, you had a clear shot at my father. Could have let that bullet hit him. Could have made it look like you tried to save him but failed. Instead, you actually saved him. Why? Melissa met his gaze steadily. Because watching your father die wouldn't bring mine back. It would just make me a murderer. And whatever else my father was, he didn't raise me to be that. The silence stretched between them, loaded with implications and unasked questions. Finally, Jiwoo sat back, some of the tension bleeding from his shoulders. My father wants to meet with you, he said. Properly. Once his ribs are wrapped and he's had enough painkillers to think straight, he believes you're an asset, something we can use. And what do you believe? I believe you're dangerous. I believe you're lying about something, even if I can't prove what yet. Jiwoo stood, reclaiming the tablet. But I also believe you saved my father's life tonight when you could have let him die. That buys you time, not freedom, not trust, but time. He walked to the door, then paused. The attack tonight, we identified the primary traitor. Former security chief named Go Taeyong. Been with my family for 12 years. My father trusted him, protected him, gave him wealth and status. And Go repaid that loyalty by selling access to assassins for a payout we traced to 17 million won and a guaranteed escape route to the Philippines. Jiwoo's expression was carved from ice. We found him 3 hours ago. He's dead now. Along with everyone he conspired with. But his betrayal cost us 6 good men. Men who died protecting a boss who'd already been sold out by someone they considered a brother. He opened the door, then looked back one final time. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow, you and my father are going to have a very long conversation about what comes next, and I suggest you be completely honest, because my patience for lies died about the same time Go did." The door closed, the lock clicked, and Melissa sat in her comfortable prison, watching the moon rise over the Ban family gardens, wondering if her father would be proud or horrified by the choices that had led her here. Sleep didn't come. Melissa spent the night watching shadows shift across the ceiling, her mind cycling through scenarios and contingencies, each one ending in variations of the same conclusion. She'd miscalculated badly, and the price for that miscalculation would likely be her life. Dawn arrived with muted gray light filtering through the window. The gardens below transformed from mysterious dark shapes into manicured perfection, ornamental cherry trees, stone paths, a koi pond that probably cost more than most people's houses. It was the kind of beauty that required constant maintenance, constant vigilance against entropy. Much like the Ban family's empire, she supposed. The same young woman from last night brought breakfast, a traditional spread that included grilled mackerel, kimchi, and fresh rice that steamed in its ceramic bowl. She also brought new clothes, more formal this time, tailored black slacks and a silk blouse that suggested Melissa was being elevated from prisoner to something more ambiguous. Guest, asset, valuable liability. "Chairman Ban will see you in an hour," the woman said, her Korean crisp and formal. "Someone will come to escort you." Melissa ate methodically, forcing down food her stomach didn't want but her body needed. She dressed with the same mechanical precision, her hands moving through the familiar routine of making herself presentable while her mind worked on the problem of survival. The truth would damn her. Lies would damn her worse, which left some narrow path between the two that she couldn't quite map yet. The escort arrived exactly on time. Not Jiwoo, but an older man with military bearing and a face that suggested he'd seen enough violence to be unimpressed by most of what life threw at him. He led her through corridors she hadn't seen during last night's arrival, past rooms where she glimpsed security personnel monitoring banks of screens, past what looked like a private armory, past evidence of wealth so profound it had stopped bothering to announce itself. Chairman Ban's office occupied the entire top floor of the eastern wing. Floor to ceiling, windows offered panoramic views of Seoul sprawling in the distance, the city's towers catching morning light like scattered jewels. The room itself was a careful balance of traditional and modern, antique furniture alongside cutting-edge technology, calligraphy scrolls hanging near digital displays showing real-time market data. The chairman sat behind a desk carved from a single piece of dark wood, his posture rigid despite the bandages Melissa could see beneath his partially open collar. Jiwoo stood near the windows, silhouetted against the morning light, his expression unreadable. Two other men occupied chairs along the wall, both middle-aged, both wearing the kind of expensive casual clothes that signaled serious wealth trying not to look like it was trying. "Sit," Chairman Ban said, gesturing to a chair positioned directly across from his desk. The positioning was deliberate, her back to the door, unable to see who might enter behind her, forced to face three men who held her life in their collective hands. Melissa sat. For a long moment, no one spoke. Chairman Ban studied her with the same intensity he'd shown at the restaurant, but now there was something else in his gaze. Recognition, maybe, or the ghost of it. He saw past the surface to the child she'd been, the daughter of a man he'd ordered killed. "Your father," Chairman Ban began, his voice rough with exhaustion or pain or both, "was one of the most dangerous men I've ever encountered. Not because he was violent, though he could be when necessary, but because he understood that information is the only currency that matters. Power can be bought, loyalty can be purchased, but knowledge is absolute." He picked up a file from his desk, physical paper, not digital, which made it both more secure and more ominous. Damien Peacock, British diplomatic cover. Actually worked for a joint task force targeting international organized crime. He spent 8 years building a network across Asia, collecting evidence on everyone who mattered, including my family. Chairman Ban opened the file, though Melissa suspected he'd memorized its contents long ago. He documented everything. Financial flows that connected us to politicians, judges, police chiefs. Shipping manifests that proved we were moving more than legal cargo. Photographs of meetings that should never have happened. And most dangerous of all, he documented our involvement in the Incheon massacre. The name landed like a stone in still water. Melissa's father had never told her the specifics. She'd been too young, he'd said, and some knowledge was too heavy for children to carry. But she'd pieced together fragments over the years. A territorial dispute between rival organizations, civilian casualties, bodies that were never found because they'd been dissolved in acid or buried where no one would think to look. 16 people died, Chairman Ban continued. Politicians investigating corruption, journalists asking inconvenient questions, witnesses who'd seen too much. We called it necessary. Your father called it mass murder. He closed the file carefully. He was right, of course. It was murder, calculated, methodical, and absolutely necessary to ensure our survival. So you killed him for knowing the truth, Melissa said, her voice flat. I killed him because he was going to publish that truth. Deliver it to newspapers, foreign intelligence services, anyone who would listen. He had a conscience, your father, a fatal flaw in a man who dealt in secrets. Chairman Ban's expression was hard, unrepentant. I gave him a choice. Take payment enough to disappear to set his family up for life and forget what he knew. He refused, called me a monster, said he'd rather die than let men like me operate with impunity. So you granted his wish. So I protected my family. Chairman Ban's hand slammed down on the desk, the first real show of emotion Melissa had seen from him. You think I wanted to kill a man who had a wife and daughter? You think I enjoyed giving that order? But he left me no choice. It was his life or the lives of everyone I was responsible for. My wife, my son, the hundreds of people who depended on our organization for their livelihoods. Thousands, actually, one of the men along the wall interjected. He had the smooth polish of a lawyer or accountant, someone who worked with numbers instead of blood. If you include legitimate businesses, supply chains, employees, the Ban family enterprise supports approximately 8,000 people directly and another 20,000 indirectly. Thank you, Advisor Yoon, Chairman Ban said dryly. I'm sure that statistical context is very comforting to Miss Peacock. Melissa said nothing. Words felt inadequate against the magnitude of what she was hearing, not just confirmation of what she'd suspected, but the casual mathematics of it. Her father's life weighed against thousands, a moral calculus that reduced human beings to numbers on a balance sheet. Jiwoo moved from the window, finally, stepping into the conversation with the kind of careful deliberation that suggested he'd been waiting for the right moment. I was 12 when my father came home that night. I remember because I was supposed to be asleep, but I'd snuck downstairs to steal cookies from the kitchen. I heard him talking to my mother in his study. Heard him say he'd given an order that couldn't be taken back. He stopped in front of Melissa's chair, looking down at her with an expression that was part apology, part accusation. I asked him about it the next day. He told me that leadership meant making choices that would haunt you, that a real leader accepts those ghosts and carries them rather than letting others bear the weight. Very philosophical, Melissa said. Did he also mention that one of those ghosts had a 13-year-old daughter who watched her house burn down with her parents inside? The words came out sharper than she'd intended, carrying 15 years of carefully contained rage. Chairman Ban's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Regret, maybe, or just the recognition that certain debts could never be repaid. You weren't supposed to survive, Chairman Ban said quietly. The fire was meant to look accidental but thorough. Your father, your mother, and yes, you, a tragedy, faulty wiring in an old building. No evidence to suggest otherwise. But I did survive. Melissa's hands were clenched in her lap, nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave marks. My father got me out, pushed me through a window while the fire was still small, before your people could establish a perimeter. He died making sure I escaped. How? Jiwoo asked. The fire investigators found 3 bodies. Dental records confirmed your identity. Wrong child. Melissa's voice was mechanical now, reciting facts to avoid feeling them. My father kept a contingency, a contact in Paris who specialized in making problems disappear. He'd arranged everything months before, fake dental records, a homeless girl who died of an overdose, everything needed to create a convincing corpse. When the fire started, my father activated the contingency. The body they found and identified as me was a stranger who'd been dead for days. The admission hung in the air. Advisor Yoon was typing notes into a tablet. The other man along the wall had gone pale, clearly not comfortable with the operational details of how families were erased. "Where did you go?" Chairman Ban asked. "After the fire." "Everywhere, nowhere. My father had established safe houses across Asia. Money in accounts that couldn't be traced. False identities ready to activate. I spent 2 years moving every few months. Manila, Singapore, Hong Kong, Tokyo. Living off his preparations while learning to hide better than he ever taught me." "And then you came back to Seoul," Jiwoo said. "Why?" "Because running forever isn't living. It's just dying slowly." Melissa met Chairman Ban's gaze directly. "And because I needed to know if the man who killed my parents was a monster or just a man making impossible choices." "And what have you decided?" "I don't know yet." Chairman Ban smiled, though there was no humor in it. "At least you're honest." He stood, moving carefully around his desk to approach her chair. Up close, she could see the pain lines etched deeper around his mouth, the way he held himself to minimize movement of his injured ribs. "You saved my life last night. Didn't hesitate, didn't let old grievances stay your hand. Why?" "Because the men shooting at you were traitors. Because watching you die wouldn't bring my father back. Because—" Melissa paused, searching for words that were true without being complete. "Because my father taught me that justice and revenge aren't the same thing. He wanted justice. Evidence presented in courts, systems held accountable, change implemented through proper channels. And he died for believing that." "Yes. So what do you believe?" It was the question Melissa had been asking herself for 15 years. What did she believe? That her father had been right to try to expose the Ban family's crimes. That Chairman Ban had been right to protect his family by any means necessary. That there was some moral truth hidden in the gray space between those positions. "I believe people are more complicated than the worst things they've done," Melissa said finally. "I believe my father was a good man who made mistakes. I believe you're a criminal who's built something that feeds thousands of families. I believe justice is important, but survival is too. And I believe that nothing I do will ever make sense of what happened." The honesty surprised her. She'd meant to be more guarded, more strategic. But exhaustion had stripped away the careful lies, leaving only the messy truth underneath. Chairman Ban returned to his desk, lowering himself into his chair with visible relief. "My son thinks you're an asset we should keep close. Advisor Yoon thinks you're a liability we should eliminate. I think you're something more interesting, a living reminder that our actions have consequences that extend beyond the immediate." He picked up the file again, then fed it into a shredder beside his desk. The machine whirred, consuming decades-old evidence in seconds. "Your father's investigation, all the evidence he collected. We found it after his death and destroyed it. Or we thought we did. Did he leave copies? Secret caches that might surface if something happens to you?" "No," Melissa said, and it was the truth. "He kept everything in one location, one perfectly secured location, and it burned with him." "You're lying," Jiwoo said. "Or at least not telling us everything. Your father was too careful to put all his eggs in one basket." "My father was dying," Melissa countered. "Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. He had maybe 6 months left when you killed him. He wasn't building contingencies. He was trying to complete one last mission before the disease did what your people didn't have to." The silence that followed was profound. Chairman Ban's expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and finally something that might have been genuine regret. "We didn't know." He didn't advertise it, kept working until the pain made it impossible to hide. The fire actually saved him from dying slowly in a hospital bed. Melissa stood, done with sitting, done with the posture of supplication. "So congratulations, Chairman Ban. You murdered a dead man walking. I hope it was worth it." The tension in Chairman Ban's office was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. CO Taemin entered without waiting for permission, his expression carrying the kind of urgency that suggested something had gone catastrophically wrong. He held a tablet in one hand and moved with the coiled energy of a man delivering very bad news to people who didn't handle bad news well. "We have a problem," CO said, his eyes flicking briefly to Melissa before focusing on Chairman Ban. "Our secure server network is locked. Everything, financial systems, communication protocols, security feeds, our entire digital infrastructure. Someone triggered a cascade lockout 30 minutes ago." Chairman Ban's face went carefully blank, which was somehow more frightening than anger would have been. Explain. The traitors had deeper access than we realized. Go wasn't working alone, we knew that, but his co-conspirators included our head of digital security, Lee Sangwoo. Before we identified him, Lee initiated a complete system lockdown. Every password changed, every biometric lock reset, every redundancy protocol disabled. Jiwoo moved to examine the tablet, his jaw tightening as he scrolled through whatever information Seo had brought. This is comprehensive. They locked us out of our own network. It gets worse, Seo said. The server controls our private security forces, communications, deployment orders, payment systems. Without access, we can't coordinate our people. We can't pay them. We can't even confirm who's still loyal and who might be working for whoever paid Go and Lee. How long does it take to break the encryption? Chairman Ban asked, his voice measured, but carrying an undercurrent of barely controlled fury. Unknown. Our people are working on it, but Lee built the security protocols himself over the past 3 years. He knew every backdoor, every vulnerability. He's eliminated them all. Advisor Yoon stood from his chair along the wall, his earlier pallor replaced by professional focus. What about bringing in outside specialists, government contacts, corporate security firms, and advertise to everyone in Seoul that the Ban family has been locked out of our own systems? Chairman Ban's voice carried the kind of quiet danger that made even Seo, a man who'd seen combat across 3 continents, take an involuntary step backward. That would be suicide. Every rival organization, every ambitious lieutenant, every politician who's ever taken our money would see weakness and attack. So we're trapped, the other man along the wall said. He'd been silent until now, content to observe, but the implications had clearly penetrated his comfortable distance from operational realities. Locked out of our own infrastructure while enemies circle. We're not trapped, Jiwoo said, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. We have people on the ground, loyal people. We can coordinate manually, use secure phone lines, which requires accessing the contact database stored on the locked servers, Seo interrupted. Lee thought of everything. He's isolated us completely. Melissa had been standing near the window, observing the controlled panic rippling through the room. She'd said nothing since Seo's entrance, content to remain invisible while the Ban family confronted the magnitude of their vulnerability. But something Seo had said triggered a memory, not her own, but fragments of conversations she'd overheard in the Gilded Lotus's kitchen, pieces of information that hadn't seemed important at the time. What kind of lockout is it? Melissa asked, her voice cutting through the tension. All eyes turned to her. Jiwoo's expression suggested he'd forgotten she was in the room, which was precisely what she'd intended. What? Seo asked. The lockout mechanism. Is it purely digital, passwords and encryption, or did Lee implement biometric verification as a final access layer? Seo exchanged glances with Chairman Ban before answering. Both. Even if we could crack the encryption, the final access requires voice authentication. Lee programmed it himself. We'd need his voice pattern to unlock the system. And Lee is dead, Jiwoo added. We found him 3 hours ago with Go, so unless you can resurrect corpses, that access is permanently locked. Not necessarily, Melissa said. She moved from the window, approaching the desk where Seo had set down his tablet. Voice authentication systems can be sophisticated, but they're not infallible. What specific phrase does the system require? We don't know, Seo admitted. Lee never documented it. Security protocol was that only he knew the passphrase. But the system must have some kind of prompt, something that indicates what it's waiting to hear. Melissa picked up the tablet, examining the locked screen. Sure enough, beneath the standard encryption barriers, there was a final prompt written in Korean. Speak the words of the old kings. The ancient dialect, the same formal tongue she'd used to greet Chairman Ban, the linguistic relic that had started this entire catastrophic chain of events. It's asking for Gyeongsang Satori, Melissa said quietly. The formal version, the kind spoken by the royal families before the modern era. Chairman Ban stood abruptly, ignoring the pain the movement caused. He crossed to the desk, reading the prompt himself. When he looked up at Melissa, his expression carried something between hope and disbelief. "You can speak it." "I can speak it," Melissa confirmed. "But I don't know what specific phrase Lee programmed. It could be anything, a proverb, a historical quote, a ceremonial greeting. Without knowing what he chose, I could attempt dozens of variations and never hit the right combination." "Lee was obsessed with legitimacy," Advisor Yoon said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him. "He came from nothing, orphaned at 8, raised in state facilities, built himself from poverty into one of our most trusted people. But he always felt like an outsider, always trying to prove he belonged among the old families. He studied their traditions obsessively, learned the dialects, memorized genealogies, and collected antique texts. He wanted to be what he could never be born as," Chairman Ban said, understanding dawning. "Noble, connected to power that existed before money became the only measure of worth." "So the passphrase would be something that reinforced that connection," Melissa said, her mind already sorting through possibilities. "A phrase that demonstrated knowledge of old traditions. Something that would separate those who truly understood the culture from those who just bought expensive suits and pretended." She closed her eyes, thinking back to summers spent with her grandmother in Jeonju. The old woman had been obsessed with proper forms, with the ways things had been done before the modern world flattened every distinction into irrelevance. She taught Melissa not just the dialect, but the philosophy behind it, the elaborate system of honor and obligation that had governed Korean society for centuries. "There's a traditional greeting," Melissa said slowly, assembling the pieces. "Used when acknowledging someone of substantially higher rank, not just formal Korean but the old form. It acknowledges 3 things: the speaker's unworthiness, the listener's elevated position, and the shared connection to ancestral traditions." She opened her eyes, meeting Chairman Ban's gaze. "But it's not just words. It requires the correct tone, the proper cadence, the precise inflection that marks it as genuine rather than memorized. I can attempt it, but if I get any element wrong, the system might lock permanently." "How confident are you?" Jiwoo asked. 70%, maybe 80 if I practice the phrase a few times." Melissa paused. "But there's another problem. Voice authentication systems are sophisticated enough to detect stress patterns, breathing irregularities, anything that suggests the speaker is under duress or attempting to fool the system. I'll need to be completely calm when I speak. No pressure, no observers, just me and the security terminal." "That's not happening," Jiwoo said immediately. "You could be working with the traders. This could be an elaborate setup to gain access to our systems." "Then you'll stay locked out forever," Melissa countered. "Because I'm the only person in this room who can speak the dialect fluently enough to pass voice authentication. Your choice: take the risk or accept that your enemies have already won." The calculation played out across Jiwoo's face. Trust versus pragmatism. Survival versus security. The same impossible mathematics that had led his father to order her family's death 15 years ago. Chairman Ban made the decision. "Take her to the server room. Seo, you accompany her. Jiwoo, monitor from outside. We attempt this once. If it fails, we implement contingency protocols and prepare for war." Seo led Melissa through corridors she hadn't seen before, deeper into the estate's infrastructure. The server room was located in what had probably once been a wine cellar, underground, temperature-controlled, with walls thick enough to absorb a direct blast. The security measures to reach it were absurd. Biometric locks, man-trap vestibules, even an old-fashioned key that Seo pulled from a chain around his neck. Inside, the room hummed with the white noise of active servers. Dozens of blade enclosures lined the walls, their indicator lights creating a constellation of blinking stars in the dim lighting. At the far end, a single terminal glowed with the ominous prompt Melissa had seen on the tablet. "You have 10 minutes, Seo said, positioning himself near the door. "Long enough to make a reasonable attempt, short enough that you can't do significant damage if this is a trap." Melissa didn't bother responding. She approached the terminal, reading the full prompt now that she could see it on a proper screen. "Speak the words of the old kings. Prove your connection to those who came before. Show that you understand what it means to serve with honor." She took 3 deep breaths, centering herself the way her father had taught her. Fear was the enemy of performance. Stress corrupted execution. She needed to be the 13-year-old girl sitting in her grandmother's kitchen, learning phrases that would seem useless until suddenly, impossibly, they weren't. The phrase formed in her mind, ancient words that carried the weight of dynasties long fallen, of social structures that had been demolished by colonization and war and modernization, but still echoed in the linguistic shadows of the past. She spoke carefully, her voice carrying the proper deference, the correct tonal variations that distinguished genuine fluency from crude imitation. Sayun chinhan muryokuro gamsahajan miamul jianhamnida. A chwinimui yunhainun hanolgwa gatgo, sayui yongsiang yun titangwa gat subnida. Jiantongui gilyul jiotnun jios, I sayui yongwangam. The translation was elaborate, nearly untranslatable in its layers of meaning. I, who am unworthy, convey my gratitude with a humble heart. Your grace is like heaven, my loyalty is like earth. To walk the path of tradition is my honor. Nothing happened. The terminal remained locked, its cursor blinking mockingly. Melissa's stomach dropped. She'd been wrong about the phrase, wrong about the approach, wrong about everything. They were locked out permanently, and she'd just exhausted her only value to the Ban family. Then the screen flickered. Text appeared, not in modern Korean but in Chinese characters, the old writing system that had been used for official documents until the 20th century. The message was simple: prove you understand not just the words but the meaning. Another test. Lee had been more thorough than she'd anticipated. Melissa spoke again, this time not repeating the formal greeting, but offering its philosophical foundation. She explained in the ancient dialect what it meant to be loyal without being servile, to be worthy of authority without claiming equality with it, to exist in the hierarchical structures that defined traditional society without losing one's essential dignity. She spoke for perhaps 90 seconds, the words flowing from some deep well of memory and understanding that she'd thought she'd lost years ago. When she finished, the silence was absolute except for the server hums. The terminal chimed. The locked screens dissolved. Access granted appeared in both Korean and English, followed by cascading menus as the entire security network came back online. Melissa turned to Seo, who was staring at the screens with an expression somewhere between relief and suspicion. It's done, she said. Your systems are unlocked. The server room's successful unlock triggered a cascade of activity throughout the Ban estate that Melissa could feel more than hear. Footsteps quickened in distant corridors. Voices rose with renewed urgency and purpose. The digital paralysis that had threatened to collapse the family's entire infrastructure had been reversed, and now the machine of the Ban organization was roaring back to life with predatory intent. Seo was already speaking rapid commands into his phone, coordinating responses that Melissa could only partially hear. Deployment orders, asset verification, instructions to find and secure individuals whose names meant nothing to her but clearly represented significant pieces on whatever chessboard the Ban family played their games upon. Jiwoo appeared in the server room doorway within minutes, his expression unreadable as he took in the now-accessible terminals. He didn't thank Melissa, didn't acknowledge the magnitude of what she'd just accomplished. Instead, he gestured for her to follow him, his body language suggesting this wasn't a request that tolerated refusal. They returned to Chairman Ban's office, where the atmosphere had transformed from controlled panic to something far more dangerous, cold, calculated fury. The chairman stood at the window overlooking Seoul, his posture rigid despite his injuries. When he turned to face Melissa, his expression carried the kind of intensity that had probably preceded every major decision of his criminal career. 6 hours, Chairman Ban said without preamble. That's how long we were locked out of our own systems. 6 hours during which our enemies could have mobilized, our allies could have abandoned us, our entire structure could have collapsed. And one waitress with a dead father's linguistic education saved us from that fate. I did what needed to be done, Melissa said, keeping her voice level. The same as last night in the restaurant. Yes, the same as last night. Chairman Ban moved from the window, each step measured and deliberate. Which raises an interesting question. You've now saved my life and saved my organization. 2 massive debts in less than 24 hours. Most people spend decades failing to earn that kind of credit with my family. I don't want credit. I want to go home. There is no home to go back to. The words came from Jiwoo, who'd positioned himself near the door, blocking it, Melissa realized. The moment you unlocked those servers, every security agency monitoring our communications became aware that someone with extraordinary linguistic skills and system access helped us. They'll be looking for you, trying to identify you. And when they do, they'll want to know everything about the mysterious woman who can speak like royalty and navigate our most secure infrastructure. That's your problem, not mine. It became your problem when you made yourself indispensable. Chairman Ban sat heavily in his chair, the movement finally betraying how much pain he was suppressing. Advisor Yoon, give her the summary. The lawyer stepped forward, his tablet already displaying information that made Melissa's chest tighten. In the past 6 hours, we've identified 17 co-conspirators in addition to Go and Lee. They range from mid-level security personnel to a regional operations director who'd been with the family for 9 years. The conspiracy was deeper and more extensive than we initially assessed. He swiped to another screen. Financial analysis shows they were being paid by the Dijian faction, a rival organization that's been trying to expand into our territories for the past 3 years. The attempted coup wasn't just about killing Chairman Ban. It was about decapitating our leadership and creating enough chaos that the Dijian faction could absorb our operations while we were paralyzed. And now, Melissa asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Now we go to war, Jiwoo said simply. We've located 14 of the 17 conspirators. By this time tomorrow, they'll all be dead or wishing they were. The Dijian faction will receive a message about what happens when you try to destroy the Ban family. And everyone who ever considered betraying us will remember why that's a fatal mistake. The casual way he discussed multiple murders should have shocked Melissa, should have triggered some moral revulsion, some reminder that she was listening to men plan executions like other people planned business meetings. But she'd spent too long in the shadows of organizations like this one. She knew the mathematics of survival in their world. Mercy was a luxury reserved for people who could afford to look weak. What does this have to do with me? Melissa asked. Everything, Chairman Ban said. You're a living problem that requires a solution. You know too much about our security, our systems, our vulnerabilities. You've demonstrated skills that make you either an incredible asset or an unacceptable threat. And most importantly, you exist in a space where my gratitude and my pragmatism are in direct conflict. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. I owe you my life. Twice. That's not a debt I can ignore or dismiss, but I also can't allow you to walk away and potentially use what you know against us, which means I need to either kill you or bind you to this family so completely that betrayal becomes impossible. The words hung in the air like an executioner's blade, suspended by thread. Melissa felt her pulse hammering in her throat, every survival instinct screaming at her to run, to fight, to do something other than sit in this chair listening to a crime lord discuss her assassination with the same tone he might use to order dinner. There is a third option, Jiwoo said, and something in his voice made Melissa's attention snap to him. He was looking at his father, not at her, and his expression carried layers of meaning she couldn't quite decode. We claim her, publicly, in a way that makes her untouchable to our enemies and indispensable to our operations. Chairman Ban's eyebrows rose fractionally. Explain. We announce her as my fiancée. Jiwoo's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if he were proposing a business merger rather than a fabricated engagement. A foreign-educated specialist who's been consulting with our organization. Someone with legitimate credentials and valuable skills. The story is that we met months ago, that the relationship has been developing quietly, and that recent events have accelerated our commitment. That's insane, Melissa said, finding her voice. No one will believe it. Everyone will believe it, Jiwoo countered. Because we'll make them believe it. We'll generate a paper trail showing your employment as a security consultant. We'll leak photos that suggest an existing relationship. We'll have respected members of our organization vouch for your character and credentials. Within a week, your presence in my life will be an established fact that no one questions. And what does this accomplish besides elaborate theater? It accomplishes everything. Jiwoo moved closer, his intensity making the air feel thin. As my fiancé, you're under the Ban family's protection, untouchable, Any attempt to harm you becomes an attack on our family honor. Any investigation into your background becomes an insult to our judgment. You become so thoroughly integrated into our structure that separating you from it becomes impossible." "You're describing a prison," Melissa said. "A gilded cage with better marketing." "I'm describing survival," Jiwoo corrected. "For both of us. You get protection from every enemy you've made by helping us. We get access to your skills without worrying you'll sell them to our rivals. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement." "I don't get a choice." "You get the same choice my father offered your father 15 years ago." Jiwoo's words were cruel in their honesty. "Accept our terms and live. Refuse and die. At least my version of the deal doesn't end with your house burning down." The comparison landed like a physical blow. Melissa looked between Jiwoo and Chairman Ban, seeing the same calculation in both sets of eyes. They'd already made this decision. This conversation was just the formality of informing her what her life would become. "There's one other factor," Chairman Ban said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested this was the piece that actually mattered. "Lee Sangwoo, our head of digital security, left a message before he died. We found it in the system logs after you unlocked them. He knew he was going to die. Either we'd kill him or the Dejian faction would eliminate him as a loose end. So he left a confession." Advisor Yoon pulled up a document on his tablet and began reading. Lee confirms he was paid to orchestrate the coup, but he also reveals that the ultimate target wasn't just Chairman Ban. The Dejian faction has been planning a comprehensive assault on our entire leadership structure. They have additional assets inside our organization, people we haven't identified yet, and they know about you. "That's impossible," Melissa said. "I've been invisible for years. No one knows who I really am." "Lee knew," Jiwoo said quietly. "He ran your fingerprints through databases we didn't even know he had access to. Found the red file. Identified you as Damien Peacock's daughter. And in his final transmission to his handlers, he reported that the Ban family had acquired an intelligence asset with extraordinary capabilities. He told them you were too valuable to ignore and too dangerous to leave alive." The implications crashed over Melissa like a tsunami. She wasn't just exposed to the Ban family, she was exposed to their enemies. Every organization that wanted to hurt the Bans now knew she existed, knew she had skills they could exploit or needed to eliminate. The invisibility she'd cultivated for a decade had been stripped away, leaving her vulnerable to threats she couldn't even map yet. "So your engagement story isn't just theater," Melissa said, understanding crystallizing. "It's armor, a public declaration that makes me too expensive to kill because any attack on me becomes an attack on your family's reputation." "Precisely," Chairman Ban said. "In our world, reputation is currency. Face is power. If we announce you as Jiwoo's intended, any harm that comes to you reflects on our ability to protect what's ours. It becomes a challenge that requires an overwhelming response. Your survival becomes tied to our honor." "And what if I refuse this generous offer of protective imprisonment?" "Then you leave this estate and we never see you again," Chairman Ban said. "And within a week, maybe less, someone puts a bullet in your head or throws you off a building or arranges an accident that closes the file on Damien Peacock's daughter permanently. Your choice, die free or live constrained." It wasn't really a choice at all, and they all knew it. Melissa had played this game before in other contexts, with other powerful men offering salvation that looked suspiciously like ownership. But she'd never been quite this cornered, quite this exposed, quite this aware that refusal meant immediate death rather than eventual consequences. "If I agree," Melissa said slowly, "I want terms. Real terms, not just pretty promises that disappear the moment they're inconvenient." Jiwoo's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been respect flickering across his features. "Name them." "First, I'm not actually marrying you. This is a performance with an end date. When the immediate danger passes, we stage a quiet separation and I get to disappear again." "Agreed," Jiwoo said, "with the caveat that we determine when the danger has passed, not you. Second, I'm not a prisoner. I need freedom to move, to live, to exist outside this estate. Monitored, fine. Guarded, acceptable. But not locked in a room like a trophy you're keeping safe." "Conditional agreement," Chairman Ban said. "You get freedom proportional to the threat level. Right now, while we're hunting traitors and preparing for war, your movement is restricted. But once we've stabilized, you get more autonomy. Third, and this is non-negotiable, I want access to my father's original investigation. Everything he collected on your family. I want to know what he died protecting. The silence that followed was profound. Chairman Ban and Jiwoo exchanged glances that carried an entire conversation Melissa couldn't hear. When Chairman Ban finally spoke, his voice was measured but firm. That information was destroyed 15 years ago. You're lying, Melissa said. Men like you don't destroy valuable intelligence. You secure it, classify it, make it inaccessible. But you don't destroy it because someday it might be useful leverage or valuable blackmail or necessary insurance. So where is it? Chairman Ban stood, walked to a bookshelf that probably cost more than most cars, and pulled out a leather-bound volume that looked like a collection of classical poetry. He opened it to reveal not pages, but a hollow interior containing a single USB drive. Your father's life's work, he said, holding it up. Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence he collected. I kept it because destroying it felt like admitting he was right about us, like confirming we were exactly the monsters he believed us to be. He set the drive on his desk, equidistant between himself and Melissa. You want the truth? Take it. Read what your father documented, see us through his eyes, and then decide if you can live with people he spent years trying to destroy. Melissa reached for the drive, her fingers closing around the small piece of plastic and metal that represented her father's legacy. It was heavier than it should have been, weighted with more than just data. So we have an agreement, Jiwoo asked. You accept our protection, play the role we need you to play, and in exchange you get to survive long enough to understand what your father died for. We have an agreement, Melissa said, pocketing the drive. But understand this, I'm not the invisible waitress anymore. I'm not the girl who hides and hopes no one notices her. If I'm going to be your shadow queen, I'm going to do it on my terms. And that means I don't bow, I don't break, and I don't forget who put my family in the ground. Jiwoo smiled, and for the first time it looked genuine. I wouldn't want you any other way. The invisible girl was useful, but the woman who speaks like kings and fights like hell, she's the one who might actually survive in our world. Don't be like the greedy traitors who lost everything trying to steal the crown. Join our community by hitting the bell icon so you never miss a chapter of this rising empire.